Jameson. I work with the University of Idaho and NRCS as a soil health extension instructor. And I've been really lucky this year to work with some amazing producers in the Magic Valley, as well as the Twin Falls Soil and Water Conservation District, NRCS, and U of I, to kind of share some stories from local producers who are doing sort of innovative, interesting things with soil health, and try and kind of follow them throughout this season. So we started out with our first recording, I think, Lance, in the end of May. And we've been kind of following up with these three producers, Lance Griff, Todd Ballard, who will hopefully join us at some point today, and Cooper and Fred Brossi. And this end of season finale sort of Zoom here is to wrap things up, kind of reflect on the season and talk through some of the things that we brought up at the beginning of the season, see how things went. And I just want to open it up now that we have a small enough group here that I think we can kind of have a relatively open discussion with questions and such. Feel free to either raise your hand to ask questions, especially if you're one of those unable to unmute yourself people, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself and interject with a question at an open moment. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our producers that we've worked with this year and key players in this. First off, thanks, Cindy, for helping run this Zoom meeting. Really appreciate it. If you have any technical difficulties, reach out to Cindy directly during this time. I do want to give a quick shout out to Steve Schuyler and Bill Bitzenberg, who have been absolutely instrumental in making this happen and keeping it going. So thank you both for your help with this project, and hopefully we can continue it moving forward. And thank you also to Lance Griff. Lance, if you could quickly say hi so folks know who you are. I think everyone does here. Lance was the first producer we worked with this year on this video project, and he's got some really interesting insights to share towards the end of the season here. So Lance.
Hey, I'm Lance.
And then Todd Ballard, I don't think is on yet, but hopefully he will be later, and we'll bring him into the table when he comes on. And then Cooper and Fred Brossi, we're roller crimping and planting beans into roller crimped rye this year, and are looking for some input and thoughts from their season this year. So Cooper and Fred Brossi. And now I would really just like to open up this discussion and ask some questions about some kind of broad scale questions, and then we can get into the more specific. So I'll start it out with a question here, and both of these producers feel free to input, and anyone else who has thoughts on this, feel free to input as well. But being a part of this process and watching all these growers throughout the season, I've noticed that there's some level of recalibrating that happens when you start using soil health practices and start doing things differently from the norm, I guess you could say. And so I'm wondering, from your experience, Lance, and from your experiences, Cooper and Fred, what type of recalibration has changing your practices required? So for example, here, I'm thinking that it was really different to assess stand counts at the beginning of the season in a lot of residue. So that's one time when I had to kind of recalibrate my brain to be able to see things going on. So recalibrating visuals, expectations, etc. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question.
I guess since I'm unmuted now, I guess I'll go first. But I guess for me and for our operation, I would probably say that it's, there's so much information out there about conventionally tilled how to grow crops and how much fertilizer you need, weed control methods, all that kind of stuff. And there definitely is a lot of information out there about no-till production and things like that, but there isn't a whole lot around here. And so there's great information out there, in the Midwest and the East Coast and other places, but there isn't a lot of great information about, well, if you do this cover crop, how much nitrogen credit do you get, or how much extra nitrogen should I put on, how much, just extra things, if you even need those. So you're kind of just, you think you're doing it right, or you think you're putting in the right nutrients out there, and maybe you end up way short with a certain nutrient because of extra residue, or the cover crop that you tilled under didn't release like you thought it would, you know, in these conditions compared to some other place where maybe it was more humid, hotter, different part of the year, colder, different part of the year. So I'd say that was, you know, for us, that's kind of a learning experience. And cover crops that do well in other places that people say, oh, you'll love these, you try them here, and either they just don't grow very well, or they become a weed and they're hard to get rid of, or, you know, there's just so much to be said about doing it here and what grows well here and what practices work here. And that's why I love about this group is, you know, we're each trying to figure these things out and then talk about it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and hopefully we can be honest about what's good, bad, and keep learning.
Awesome, thank you.
Well, I'll second what a lot of what Lance said. Is I think we all suffer from a little bit of, well, that'll never work here sort of mantra, and we just need to do our best to squelch that and put it aside a little bit and just keep trying. And more directly to Jackie's question, stand counts were an issue for us that we just were unfamiliar with, you know, evaluating a stand of beans in broadcast form. And luckily Rich Bupp helped us a little bit with that, and we sort of realized what we had or didn't have, and after talking to some of the bean wizards in the Magic Valley, decided we needed to replant. So that left us kind of uncomfortable, just not knowing, you know, how good it looked or how bad it looked. And I guess maybe that's one reason that next year we're going to try again with going to a more row setup. What other recalibration or uncomfortable moments required more thought, Dad?
Well, we couldn't get rid of the rye. The rye became the weed. That was it's still a weed. It's still there. It's never going to go away, I'm afraid. So that was uncomfortable, still uncomfortable. The learning curve is just way steeper, I think, than we anticipated on this. Because we had planted no-till broadcast stand in a little corner just to watch it a couple years ago, and it looked really great. And I tried planting into rye a few years before that using a roller harrow to kill the rye, and knew that didn't work. But putting it all together, a la Rodale, just didn't pan out for us. So, like Cooper said, we're going to try again. I don't know.
Well, and I'll say, you know, I'll add that I think we're humble enough to know we don't know enough, obviously. And as Lance was saying, there are folks who've done this pretty successfully in other places, and we, you know, Ed and I just need to do a lot more homework, mining those good ideas and trying to morph them and apply them to our situation in the arid West under irrigation, and see what tune-ups are needed, you know, and maybe that's where this group comes in too, to help recognize and find those red flags that, hey, you know, this practice works in Wisconsin, great, but don't forget to adjust this or that for Idaho.
Well, probably the biggest thing is that we found out that pinto beans aren't soybeans. I think that's the huge lesson we learned. Soybeans and rye seem to go well together, but it doesn't hold true for pinto beans in our experience.
So I wanted to bring up an interesting sort of commonality between a couple of the fields that we visited this year, getting a bit more into specifics around mold. And a couple of the folks that I've talked to have pulled this out of the videos as well, that with more residue on the ground, it seemed as though both Lance and Todd remarked on seeing less mold in their fields than their neighbors did. So I'm curious Lance, Bill, really anyone else who grows beans, if you wanted to maybe discuss a little bit of that observation.
Yeah, so like you said, Jackie, I think this is about the third year that we've done like high residue with beans, and every year we haven't had mold. And let's see, 2 years ago, a couple seasons ago, we had the most residue when we planted directly into corn stalks there by close to Bill's place. That corn, was leftover thrashing corn stalks that were just flat on the ground, some standing, and it was a tremendous amount of residue. So that was probably the most we've ever done, which that's where I would have kind of expected to see it. And it really just wasn't there. And that was the thickest crop too. I mean, those beans got huge, and I would have thought we would have seen mold there. I guess haven't done enough research, or not smart enough, haven't figured it out why. I mean, obviously biologically, there's a reason why we haven't got mold, why we didn't get mold. And then the past 2 years, we also haven't, in not as high a residue situation. And in places the beans weren't good enough to get much mold because they just weren't thick enough, didn't have enough canopy closure. But I think just biologically having more residue there covering the soil, just for some reason, lets those microbes maybe take care of some of those issues, those mold issues. What are your thoughts, Fred and Cooper and Bill?
Lance, I'm actually not at all surprised to hear that you didn't have mold, because my experience with mold over however many years I've grown dry beans is that it's really about soil splash more than anything. The sclerotia are always once you have mold in a bean field, you're always going to have the sclerotia in that field, regardless of your rotation. So when you come back to beans or even potatoes, and you have bare soil and you have splash, you're going to see mold when you have humidity. And I think with good residue, you just don't have that. And that's my guess on it. I'm not an agronomist, but that's my take on it.
Well, and that's another reason we were really looking forward to moving into this more at wholesale at a big acre scale, because we wanted beans that stood up, that weren't flat, wouldn't flop over on the ground and be more susceptible to mold, regardless of the residue armor we might have to prevent soil splash. But just that these techniques might support more upright beans than previously.
I think you two are right on with reduced soil splash, as well as being upright and physically off of the soil. That all makes a lot of sense.
Does it go back to what Lance was saying about his corn also, that he spread the waterings out so the foliage had more time to dry out? Was that true in your beans also, Lance, that you slowed down the pivot?
Yeah, I was able to slow the pivot down, far more than if I had conventionally tilled them and then had to dam or dike them. Was able to slow the pivot down and just not even have to run it as much, just because there was so much covered, and the evapotranspiration just wasn't nearly as high, and just seemed like it helped.
Yeah, I was up on Lance's field last year because I was sure I could find mold, because with sprinklers, I can't grow beans without spraying a fungicide. I just can't do it. And sometimes twice. So it gets, that can cost up to $60 an acre just to fly on fungicides twice, maybe more. And so I was up in Lance's field last year in that corn residue. I was going to find mold, and I could find some mushrooms growing, but I could never one piece of white mold anywhere. So it was kind of amazing that was it. And it wasn't because I watered on wheel lines. You're watering, once every 6 or 7 days. And, so it has plenty of time to dry the foliage out and stuff. It's something to do with that bare ground, and what it is, I don't know. Maybe Linda'd have some thoughts, or Sean.
There we go. Operator difficulty with unmuting. I think we've all seen the rainfall simulator demo and the white backboard to that thing. And if you've ever noticed at the end of that demonstration, how much soil is up on that, it's pretty impressive. And it's not just right near the surface. It reaches, that thing's over 12 inches tall, and there's soil particles all the way to the top of it. You know, and after I watched the videos, I sent Jackie an email about this, because I noticed the thing with the mold, and I sent her an email, and that was my speculation too, Fred, was that that without the soil splash, there's probably not enough problem actors in terms of the mold communities on those plants to reach some sort of critical threshold where it really becomes a propagating problem, or whatever you want to call it, where it really just takes off. But yeah, that makes all the sense in the world to me.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing. So I want to change directions a little bit, and I want to bring us to the topic of fertility here. And a few of you have touched on that in your videos, changing dynamics with fertility, maybe a little bit of nitrogen tie-up with high carbon cover crops involved in the rotation. So I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit to changes in patterns with fertility and sort of what some of the needs are in these reduced tillage systems and or cover crop systems. And feel free, anyone else, regardless of whether you're videoed this summer or not, to interject any observations you've seen in your operation.
Get in there, go.
Well, our fertility program for a long time has been pretty basic, and we generally just apply a healthy amount of composted dairy manure and maybe on occasion some humic acids or fulvic acids. And on occasion, maybe a few rock minerals or something, but we generally rely on the cover crops to build soil health and build fertility just by feeding the soil microbe and the soil microbiome. And I don't know what else to say beyond that. I mean, I guess this year we did do a little more targeted, specific micronutrient applications because our replanted beans were so late, and we were really trying to eke out some kind of return. And so we sort of threw a Hail Mary pass and tried to put on some things that we thought might speed up maturity and just make sure the beans had everything they needed based on sap analysis of the plants themselves. But that was a real rare circumstance, and I don't know that we'll do that again necessarily.
Probably not. I really don't anticipate changing anything, switching to no-till. We may find out that we need to, but I just don't, because our compost will go on pre-tillage on tilled ground or top dress on alfalfa ground, and it doesn't seem to make any difference over time. We're still replenishing what we extract, whether it's baled hay or grain or beans or whatever. But so I cannot say we had any tie-up issues with that rye. We may have had allelopathic issues, but I don't blame anything there on lack of fertility.
Okay. Interesting. I think that between you and Lance in this setting, we're talking obviously organic versus largely a more inorganic fertilizer applications, and so potentially pretty different observations there. Lance, are you able to talk a little bit to your fertility? I know you mentioned in the video that you felt like you might have been a little bit low on nitrogen in both of your crops.
Yeah, so we've switched over to doing a lot more, manure. We used to use some compost. We don't use a whole lot of compost, but we just use more manure. So I feel like we're getting, most of our micronutrients and those kind of nutrients through the manure, and also, just the biology and the carbon that comes with it. So yeah, I would say we've kind of shifted our focus to try to release some of those nutrients that are there already in the soil. So just try to get the soil biologically active enough that just try with the products that we do apply is kind of just about getting the biology going. I would say it's not super high in nutrients, other than we are putting, we're putting 32% nitrogen on corn with the planter and also through the pivots, just because corn is a high nitrogen user. But as far as the other nutrients, we aren't adding really much more, just because of the manure use and the biologicals, just trying to get the release of those nutrients through the biology. And, just kind of keep an eye on that through tissue sampling, just to make sure that we're getting enough. So yeah, I think definitely we used to just put out inorganic products, just kind of treat the soil as a chemistry set, kind of like Ray Archuleta talks about, instead of trying to get the biology going, kind of work for us. And I feel like, we still need to add those nutrients, because we're not, most of our farm isn't, we don't farm most of our farm organically. There is some acres we do, but not all of them. So we're still adding nutrients out there, but just trying to use more biology to get going, so we don't have to use as much.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a sort of commonality I've seen between the two of your places, even being quite different operations, is the focus on feeding the soil and feeding the microbes as opposed to directly feeding the plants. Mm-hmm. That is a big shift.
Mm-hmm.
I see that Todd has joined us, Todd Ballard. Todd, can you hear me?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah, so we were just talking through some changes or not changes in fertility programs when adopting cover crop use and or reduced tillage or soil health practices. And I was wondering if you had anything to add to the conversation on that front.
No, I think pretty much what everybody else has said, it's kind of what I'm following along too. Just trying to get all the good guys working for me.
Fair enough. So I'd like to open it up and see if anyone in the audience here has questions they'd like to ask or pose to the group.
Hey, Jackie, and everybody else that's on here, thanks for stopping in. This is a great forum and has been a fantastic exchange of information through the year, so thank you. I just wanted to reiterate a few thoughts on the fertility. And Lance, I think you hit it perfectly. It is extremely common to see primarily a nitrogen tie-up when you're converting from a traditionally tilled system to a no-till system, particularly when you're using cover crops. And as your microbiology begins to become more diversified, you will see that nutrient tie-up begin to taper off. But there is definitely a lag time between when you first make that conversion to more of a higher residue, lower disturbance system. You definitely see it in your cereal grains and your corn, your annual grasses, more so than you would in a legume crop. That seems to be common no matter where we're at in the country. I know we experienced that on our acres back in Pennsylvania when we made the switch. Of course, now we're 26 years into a zero-till system, 28 years, and actually have gotten away from chemical fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer in completely, and allow the soil and the covers to do all the nutrient fertility cycling. So not having to spend any money on fertility is definitely a nice situation to be in. And I think going back to the first point as far as calibration, just wanted to reinforce to everyone that's trying this is you are going to experience different things on different fields and on different farms. And your approaches to, try a few things, see how they work out, check your results, and then move forward with the mindset that you will have to recalibrate to fit your management on your operation. And that's the only way that it's ever going to work for you. Absolutely. Our soils here in Idaho, particularly under irrigation, are going to function different than those in like the Mississippi River Valley or the East Coast. The concepts are generally the same, but the functionality is going to be different and unique to everyone's operation. So I applaud you guys for trying things and accepting that, it's not going to be perfect in all situations on the first try. So it definitely takes a commitment from you guys to try something and be able to say, hey, this did work and this didn't work. I know up at Brossie's this summer, it was definitely disappointing to see some of the results from that. It felt like we were doing everything correctly. But some of the indirect effects, I thought, even though we did not get the beautiful pinot bean crop that we were looking for, but one of the noticeable side effects was there was significantly less weed pressure from the regular annual broadleaves in the cover crop, the rolled cover crop field, than there was in a conventional field. There was practically no lamb's quarter, no kochia in that rolled cover crop field. That was shocking to me, particularly compared to the conventional field that was right next to it, which was cultivated twice. So it was tilled and cultivated twice, I think, or once maybe. But that
was cultivated, I don't remember how many times, Rich, but same field history. So it was very, you're right, it was a very stark contrast. The worst weed in either field actually were potatoes last year, but there are definitely more annuals in the cultivated side, no question about it.
So yeah, that recalibration is definitely going to need to happen. It's going to be unique to everybody's operation. So from a consultant perspective, you guys are doing everything right from the perspective of having to try things and then adjust accordingly.
Rich, with all of that being said, with respect to the fertility, is there a way during these transitions to ballpark guess based on soils, the crop being raised, and the various factors, what sort of mixes we might need to consider. As Lance said, if they're planting corn that needs a lot of nitrogen, the legume component in our mixes, is there a way to kind of compartmentalize or come up with a way to help with this transition? Because apparently the nitrogen release, from what I'm hearing, is a concern. It's kind of a wild card.
Yes, actually, you're exactly right. And just like anything else, that the field history, the crop history, that irrigation schedule, the weather, the time of thing, time of cover crop termination, all of those things will factor into nutrient tie-up and release, including, how healthy the micro rhizome is, that will aid in decomposition of the cover crop. So once you build up a really healthy mycorrhizome, you'll find that the nutrient tie-up from a cover crop is a lot less, because you have active decomposition of those that biomass, pretty much 12 months of the year. Obviously, it's going to be more active at certain times than it is others. And some of that compensating for that nutrient tie-up will come from, like I said, it depends on planting time, but then application time, like if you're coming back in with a side dressing or a foliar feeding action, the timing of that is really important, and it's going to be unique to every crop and almost every field. That's not a direct, simple or slam dunk answer, but it really, it takes that level of management. Dave Brandt, I think, he put it really well. It's like when you move to a no-till system, the font size that you want to use in the word management goes from 10 font up to 140 font. Really, you take that time out of the cab of the tractor and you put it into the time spent on managing the growth of that crop and making decisions based on information and planning and actions to avoid having to do a cultivation. I don't know, does that help? Does that get to your point, Steve?
Sort of, I guess, and because we have so many unknowns, the weather and, my gosh, it goes on forever. Just trying to get a handle on the timing of the release is, during the transition period, while the guys before the rhizosphere, before the microbial populations are established, I think is one of our big concerns. We don't want guys to have, a year or two or three of dramatically decreased yields. If there's something we can do to advise them, as far as planting more legumes or planting a little more of certain species to facilitate the release of, particularly of nitrogen at certain times.
Okay, yeah. So let me try to be a little bit more specific then. Say we're going, we have a winter cover crop planted and we're going into corn. We know there's going to be some nitrogen tie up with the decomposition of that cover crop. If that cover crop is diversified and has, say, like hairy vetch in it, or a winter pea or a legume, There will be more nitrogen available for that corn crop. Beginning probably middle June, if it's terminated in early May. That stuff will start to break down and become available when it's needed. But it's most likely, if that's a very healthy cover crop and it has like a cereal in it, if it has, say, 20,000 pounds of cereal rye cover crop, the tie-up is going to be so significant that the amount of nitrogen that comes available from that cover crop isn't going to be available or to be able to compensate for the tie-up, the decomposition of that cereal rye. So in a situation like that, and Lance mentioned tissue sampling, that's a great way to tell in that corn crop whether you are in a strained condition and may need to apply, or if you have an adequate amount. There's several charts and tables that have been made available for guests making a kind of a rough guess at nutrient tie-up from decomposition of cover crops, primarily going into corn. Those I know have been out for a few years, and they've been doing a lot of studies on that in the Midwest. So as far as recommending a cover crop mix to compensate for those things, I would definitely lean more towards, you know, a legume rich cover crop mix, and less annual grasses. But that, I've had some trouble with like winter peas in this valley being viable. So, you know, I don't think that's been perfected yet as far as what is going to be the best thing to minimize nutrient tie-up in a cover crop going in primarily into a corn crop. It's going to take some experimentation, Steve.
Well, we've got some interesting stuff going on, Jackie and Bill, and I've been watching one guy who does the peas, a monoculture cover crop of peas. I don't know, Jackie, if you want to spend any time talking about that, but we don't need to. But it was interesting, some of the stuff preliminarily that we found.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about this is that it is very condition dependent, how quickly things break down and how quickly nutrients become available. Condition dependent meaning weather dependent, soil health dependent, microbe dependent, all of these factors. So the study that Steve is referring to is in the Twin Falls area. We're looking at over the season and over actually a couple of years, how pea residue breaks down and becomes available to plants in an organic system. So stay tuned for that. We're currently analyzing results from this year, and we'll be hopefully sharing some of that information coming up here this winter. So really looking forward to having some more place-based specific information.
Well, so Jackie, I'd like to weigh in on that. Pardon me, Rich. I just think we need to step back a little bit and probably defer to Lance on this more than anything, Steve. But so you can't cold turkey anything in this biological world without expecting a shock. So if you're moving from conventional tillage and a conventional fertility program, trying to become more biological and going to cover cropping and no-till, you're going to still have to come up with some releasable fertility inputs in the interim period. And I think Lance has probably had more experience than any of us with using things like pelleted chicken manure and things like that at planting time. And it's not so much that you're trying to replace the season-long needs, you're trying to give that plant a good boost out of the ground and also kind of promote biology at the same time that will, in fact, allow you to have a season-long release when the plant's hungry. But it's just a different way of thinking about it. But I do think that you have to consider the fact that weaning off conventional fertility products, especially in a no-till cover crop system, is just going to be a shock no matter how you slice it. So, but there are certainly biological nitrogen sources that are fairly soluble or more available, put it that way. That could be used at planting if you're set up for it. That would, help bridge that gap. Because cover crops are always going to be a long-term prospect. That's why it's so frustrating to watch people plant them one year and say, "Oh, that didn't do any good. That didn't help me. That hurt me." But that's not a fair test because it's a system and it takes time to move it from one end to the other on the spectrum.
Well, and it could be that I'm not hearing the conversation holistically or adequately here, but I'll take it one step further. If we're so concerned about fertility of a few key nutrients, then we probably shouldn't be asking cover crops to solve those issues. If people are concerned about nitrogen deficiencies, they're in a completely different frame of mind, like Dad's sort of alluding to. But how often do we know that nitrogen deficiency is actually the real problem behind yield drag or reduced yields? As Lance mentioned, tissue sampling, and as I mentioned, sap analysis, those are great tools to really see what the plant needs. Does it need another 50 units of N? Probably not. It probably has some other key deficiency that may or may not be addressed through cover crops. But if we're just focusing on NPK, we're talking past each other and past the concept of cover cropping, because it does so much more and at a different time scale than just adding NPK.
Thank you for adding that in there. I think those are really important points to share. This is a system we're working with, not a input, output, simple balance. So thank you for sharing that.
And I think, Cooper, you're right, because I think so much of our mentality, taught by universities and schools and things like that is just such okay, you're short on this nutrient, you need to add it in this form, and boom, problem fixed, or whatever. It's kind of looked at as a chemistry set, not as a holistically like you guys are talking about. And just kind of going back to the cover crops, I don't know if you guys have felt the same way, but after I put a cover crop in, after my wheat or barley that comes off early enough to put a cover crop in, it seems like I've tried lots of different legume products, or varieties, species, things like that. Clovers are too slow to do much. They don't come up, but they don't do a whole lot to make much difference. We've tried winter peas, winter lentils. They seem like they get up, they're pretty small. And I'm not saying they don't do good. They aren't, benefiting the system for, what they're doing underground. But from what I've done, I can't get much nitrogen credit for the next crop, because it seems like my wheat or barley volunteer comes up just as quick as the cover crop does. And then it just kind of takes over. You can go out there and find those other species out there. But so what I'm going to try this year to try to actually get some nitrogen credit and have a crop, growing, the cover crop growing, I guess, with the wheat, is I'm going to try frost seeding some red clover. And I think I talked to Cooper about this a few weeks ago when we had talked. And, I hear of guys doing it in certain parts of the country or in Canada. It's a big thing in certain places there. But just going out and frost seeding, I'm putting on my fertility, putting on top dressing my urea and some ammonium sulfate on at the same time as I'm putting the red clover on in, say, February. Whereas normally I'd wait till, April or May, probably April, to put on my wheat top dress fertilizer. I'm going to try in February, put on some red clover at 10 pounds of the acre, and then just see what happens. Try a pivot of it. see if I can get that red clover to establish. You know, is that rate going to be too high? Is that going to be not high enough? Is the red clover going to get choked out in a good crop of wheat? I don't know.
Yep.
You know, rather than do all my wheat acres that way, I'm going to try to pivot and see how that works. And then I guess my thought is then if, you know, whatever survives that wheat crop and, you know, after we get the straw off, then I can turn the pivot on immediately and that crop is already established. And then whatever volunteer wheat or barley does come up, that clover is already ahead of it. And hopefully I can get a decent enough stand. It's not going to hurt my yield in wheat, but also the wheat isn't going to choke out the clover. And I think Cooper said you guys have done a little bit of that. And then hopefully it'll grow through the fall. It'll get, you know, continue to grow through the springtime. And then I can terminate that, just spray it out. I won't work it up or anything, just spray it and then plant corn into it. I don't know. I just haven't been super happy with my cover crop, some of the species that we typically grow around here. You know, like you say, cover crops are great. I agree, cover crops are great. But for what I was trying to do, it wasn't doing a whole lot for me. So I guess just a different way of trying to accomplish what I'm trying to do.
Yeah,
Very
that
curious to hear
concept
how that
of, yeah, we're looking forward to seeing how that goes, Lance. I'd be happy to talk more about it. But that concept of shingling crops together or relay cropping them and having a growing polyculture where one then, you know, the cash crop is sort of followed by or superseded by some sort of living root cover crop or a second cash crop or whatever. That makes the most sense to us, because then you're not fighting to get your planter in the field right behind the combine. You're not waiting for anything else. It's already happening. Just anything we can do to co-schedule work like that, you know, planting and fertilizing at the same time, obviously is where we need to head, so that we can have living polycultures that we can make a living from and also produce food.
I think you're right on, Lance. My only comment is that if you have good wheat, like 100+ bushel wheat, you probably won't have great clover. But if you have kind of not as good a wheat, you'll have wonderful clover. Every time I've done it, it's been kind of mixed, where the wheat was really good, the clover got shaded out. You know, we have the same problem flying covers into our 22-inch corn. They look dynamite, and then the corn gets 10 feet tall, and where'd the cover go? You know, but if the corn's not as good, then you're like this year, the corn wasn't as good, and we got some pretty cool cover out there right now. So, you know, it's a trade-off, but I think you got to keep chipping away at it. I don't know what you're going to pay for 10 pounds of clover seed, but I think it's well worth doing. So I encourage you to try it.
Yeah, and I tried kind of a small experiment just in a cornfield. That corn was about knee high, and I just thought, well, hey, I've got this bag of alfalfa seed. I'm going to take a little hand spreader and go spread some out in the alfalfa or in the cornfield, just because I thought sometimes we'll follow corn with alfalfa, but I always have to wait till the spring to plant it. And so I thought, well, heck, if I could go out here and, you know, even if I had to up the rate, what would happen if I spread this out here, get it growing, and then maybe I wouldn't lose that time lose that whole first cutting basically. And so I just went out with a hand spreader and I spread a couple different passes, and I did one at like a single rate. And I don't know what the rate was, but it wasn't a tremendous amount. And then I double spread one spot. And I was surprised at how much alfalfa actually made it. I mean, I looked throughout the season and it was way more than I thought was going to be out there. Just once the corn got shaded it and all that, I thought this is going to just get choked out. But when we went out there to harvest that corn, and it was thrashing corn, so we didn't come off super early. So it's not like it was, you know, silage, boom, it's got sunlight again. There was a lot of alfalfa left. So I guess I'm hopeful. And like you were saying, in the bad spots of your wheat, that's where the clover was. But I guess in one way, maybe that's where the ground could use that clover, you know, it just isn't exactly the ground, and that clover took off and really benefited there. So I'm excited.
And if we don't have clover, we'll probably have weeds.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think both you and Cooper are on the right track where you're trying to overlap, relay, however you want to call it. I think it makes really good sense.
And I think if it works well, then we would do it every year, because I don't know about you guys with the beans, but I can't seem to find a variety that's short season enough, that stands up well enough that I can do the no-till bean type of deal. In fact, I'm not having any beans this next year. We're not growing a single bean, which is the first for us in a, we've not grown beans before on drought years out here, but every year we've had plenty of water. We have grown beans every year for probably 50 years. And we're cutting out beans completely because I can't just, and from what we've seen with planting into more residue, your day length, you just need a shorter season bean. That ground being cooler for whatever reason. When we had those beans planted into that corn stalk residue, we had a field side by side. One way we dished it all up, treated it conventionally. The other field was in corn stalks. The corn stalk field was 2 weeks behind the other field easily. And then this year I had black beans that were a stand-up variety. They were like a 103-day variety, which is longer than what we usually grow by quite a bit. And it got frozen. The beans look good, and they got frozen that September 8th or 9th, that first frost. And it just makes you sick because you got this nice looking plant and boom, frost, bean shuts down, so I'm just tired of fighting the beans and doing all that. So maybe with this clover is a way I can get that legume back into my system. And yeah, we are growing more alfalfa, but it stays in for 3 or 4 years. And so it's not like I'm rotating every year. So that clover could maybe give me that benefit without having to grow beans.
Don't give up on the beans, Lance. I mean, it'll work eventually. You just need to just go back to Othello's or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't like the Othellos because they don't stand up nearly good enough for me.
Well,
but they'll hang up on your wheat straw stubble and they'll be climbers.
Here's an idea. Yeah, leave that wheat tall, but more maybe switch to your no-till drill and broadcast them. Then I think they will stand up. Here we're about to go to row planting now, not broadcast, but that may work too. So don't quit. Just keep experimenting.
Well, on that note, we're moving forward going to try to look for shorter day beans that we think will work in our region with more regional adapted genetics, and try to even push those beans shorter if we can. We've engaged some bean wizards and some breeders to try to help us with this effort and really try to, if you build it, they will come sort of deal. Like if we can just shorten it by a few days, that might make all the difference. And adapt that cold start. That's probably the bigger issue, is just getting them up and getting them going so that they can utilize all that sunlight and heat in early June instead of being stuck down there in the cool soil.
I was going to switch gears a little bit here. One of the reoccurring problems with switching to armoring the ground with cover crops and using a heavy residue rotation is voles. I'd like to know what each of you, how big a problem it was. You're in 3 different areas. Is it a problem everywhere? What have you done about it, or what can you do about it?
Well, I'll jump in first on that one, Bill. So voles are very cyclical, as I'm sure you're aware. And knock on wood, we are right now at the trough on vole populations. They're just starting to come back, headed up to a wreck. And I know you guys out on Salmon Track have been in that wreck for quite a while. It seems like it's been a longer cycle for you than our cycles are usually short, but sometimes they're back to back. We've been really lucky. And I know that in that rye thatch, voles, when they get up to big populations again, we're gonna have a problem. And I know that, but I don't know what the answer would be organically. I don't think there is one. I know you can spray baited grain on a conventional farm. I'm not sure quite what the rules are for that, but You know, that's, I guess we're gonna just cross that bridge when we come to it.
Yeah, for us, there was some vole pressure in not so much the corn. There was some in the corn, but not too bad. In the beans, you know, it was hard to tell because, like I said in the video, you can't really see what kind of damage you have early on because it's down in all that residue. So it's hard to see. And the beans are small too. So sometimes you walk out there and you think, oh, there's no beans here. The voles got them. And then you dig down there and they're popped up, but they're just so small you can't tell. So there was some vole pressure there, but it wasn't bad in the beans. So I guess one way that we try to fix that or help is we mow down our pivot corners. All our pivot corners are planted to crested wheatgrass. And so, you know, it's kind of permanent vole habitat because we never till it or anything like that. And I guess that's a bad thing about the salmon track is most of our pivot corners and all the neighbors included too are, you know, kind of vole habitat. So we went around, like in the summer, we'll go around and whip down all the corners and just hopefully the predators can see them and get down to them. And that's one way we've tried to do it. And, you know, there happened a few years ago where we had a cornfield that was so bad with voles that the inspector, crop insurance adjuster, came out and said that they'd eaten 60% of the crop. Luckily, it was just a mini pivot, but we just pulled the disc out and disced it up. Went to beans that year because it was so bad. So it definitely can get bad. So I guess whipping our pivot corners down is what we've done.
A large producer in Burley claims that sorghum Sudan grass will suppress voles for a few years now. I haven't tried this out. I haven't seen it work, but he claims it works for him. I don't know. Somebody should try it somewhere.
Yep, barn owls
back
just
when
popped up in the chat, and that's something that we do have. That's the only defense we have at the moment is a series of barn owl boxes, and we just bought 6 more that we'll put up around our farm. We have major adjacency issues, just like Lance was talking about, where we're completely surrounded by wildlands. So if we don't have voles, we have jackrabbits. If we don't have jackrabbits, we have elk or deer. So it's really just a trade-off between those 4 major herbivores. Oh, and number 5, the rock chucks. So we have plenty of herbivore predation to deal with. And we're just, knock on wood, the owls will keep the voles at bay enough going into the future. But
We need some owls that are big enough to take down elk and deer, but we haven't found them yet.
They're called drones. Yeah. Brad McIntyre, when he started no-till in Marsing area, he had couple years of vole problems, and we actually called Gabe Brown that year and was complaining to Gabe, and he says, man, I'm sorry, but I can't believe your ecosystem is that far out of balance. And it kind of set us back a little bit. It's like, damn it, we were looking, you know, but honestly, when we thought about it, our ecosystem is out of balance. And so we found out that Canyon County weed department, they build an owl box and maintain it for life for $150. And so Brad immediately had him put up 1 owl box per 40 acres. And I've been in some of his alfalfa fields and we scared up just walking through the alfalfa pasture. It was not alfalfa, it was pasture. There was 5 or 6 owls that scared up on the ground, and we're going, what are they doing? And we started paying attention to the ground, and they were down on the ground on the vole and mice highway, you know, down in the canopy. But anyway, Brad's had pretty good success with the owl boxes. Now, last time I talked to him, he said the stinking hawks started invading some of the owl boxes. And so maybe our hole was too big, you know, if a hawk can get in it. But anyway, owl boxes, I think, is something we got to do because we don't have no trees for them anymore. You know, we've taken the habitat away.
So I know there was a
think the
question in the group.
Pocatello-
What was that?
Go ahead, Jackie.
There's a question in the group. I think Bill wanted to ask some specific questions about direct harvest on beans, since there was some experience in this group with direct harvest. Bill, did you have something specific you wanted to address there?
Yeah, it's kind of, we're always looking for ways to, promote this by saving dollars. I just wonder, all of you had experience with direct harvest or semi-direct harvest. I just wanted you to talk about the savings and, amount of loss compared to conventional, like using a picket compared to, direct harvest. You guys could speak to that. Would be kind of interesting to know.
So this was my first time. We had swath beans before and then run the combine through, and that worked well. This was the first season that we actually desiccated the beans, and then then came in with the combine, and it worked well. I see why guys in the Midwest or wherever use a land roller to kind of push those small rocks and, decent sized rocks down to the ground, because it seemed like every once a round or so, a small rock would stop one of my draper belts. It would kind of go around and get wedged, stop the draper belt. So I'd have to get out and fix that. But yeah, it was, I really liked how that part of it worked. I don't know if there's savings money wise, because I had to, normally run a picket through there to windrow them. I had to go out and desiccate. And even then, there were still some weeds that weren't fully dried down yet, but the beans were ready. So that was my first time desiccating. Maybe I did it too late. I don't know. But it was nice not having to run a picket through. And then you still have that root mass left underground that residue. My combine was able to spread the residue the full width of the combine, instead of in the past, we'd run a picket through, you'd disturb all the root mass, and then you'd run the combine through, and you'd only spread 10, 15 feet wide. And so you'd have chaff rows out there. And we typically would run a harrow out there to spread the residue more, but it's not the same as, getting the residue spread right the first time. So that'll be a definite benefit this coming season, because in that field now with the residue spread evenly and the root mass still there, I will just be able to plant corn directly into that and not have to do any kind of tillage, no harrowing, nothing like that to spread the residue. So that was definitely a big benefit, big plus to direct harvesting.
Todd, you're kind of the most experienced with direct harvest here. What can you offer?
I think it works pretty well. I don't know that you lose that much more than conventional. I did notice this year we tried to maybe push it a little bit after we desiccated. And if I do it again, I would wait a little longer, maybe go 2 weeks after we sprayed, just to let the material dry down a little bit more. Of course, part of the problem this year was the smoke. So I don't know. It's a work in progress like everything else. Where you have a thicker stand, it works better. You have a better success rate of picking everything up with the better stand, and it just everything works better. In the thin spots, it doesn't work as well. It's pretty depressing, but that's my take on it.
I have an idea for Lance to try. I don't know if it'll work with dry beans, but I did see a video of a stripper header working in dry peas. Bean pods are way bigger, but it's worth a shot.
Yeah, we've kind of looked into that with our stripper heads, and from what I understand, from what people have told me and I've read, is that the stripper heads can work well in the beans or the peas, things like that, if the pods are kind of in a relatively small area that they kind of get set. Because people were talking about, oh, could you do soybeans with them? And somebody was like, yeah, you can, But if, typically with soybeans, you got pods from the bottom to the top. And so then you kind of make a mess because that stripping rotor is stripping all the way through the plant, and you're kind of spreading some of those beans, the bean out. So I think with certain varieties, I think a stripper head could work well.
So this kind of brings me to my next question here about residue management. I know this is a common theme and sort of question and maybe challenge for people just starting out with minimum till and reducing their tillage. I'm wondering if folks can talk a bit about any lessons learned or questions, I guess, about residue management in a reduced tillage operation. And feel free for anyone to chime in on this question. Tyson, I know you have some experience with this, some other folks in the crowd here. If you wanted to share some thoughts on residue management.
Well, I'll just jump in and say first off that if you don't have an aftermarket chaff spreader on your combine, hang up this call right now and go buy one. You got to find one somewhere because that makes all the difference. Lance and Todd and many others in the Magic Valley Soil Health Forum have commented on this in the past, and we've experienced it ourselves. Just you got to spread that chaff out the full width of the header you have, or as far as you can. Otherwise, no tilling behind it, and even conventional tillage behind a heavy cereal crop, it's just, you're going to have challenges. It's just not going to be like you want it to be.
Well, and just to reconfirm that, what I like to share with my clients when we're talking about residue during harvest, residue managed during harvest, is think of that residue as your part of your fertilizer program for your next crop. And if it's in rows, I mean, we know that putting fertilizer in rows, a 3-foot row over a 25-foot head is or a 25-foot cut is not going to be sufficient for the following crop. It creates all kinds of problems. So that residue is, that's the food for your microbiology to produce fertility for your following crop. So being able to manage that residue is as important as harvesting the crop itself. So yeah, absolutely. Do whatever you have to. If that's a spreader, spreading it out, additionally using a harrow, whatever. But the more evenly distributed you can get that residue post-harvest, the better for your subsequent production.
I did the first year we did no-till in some fall-went wheat, planted corn into wheat residue. We had just dropped the straw behind the combines, came back and baled it, so we had a pretty good chaff row. And by the time the baler runs through there, it kind of spreads the residue out, the chaff, into a swath about, it's like 7 feet wide by the time you run the baler through there. And I wanted to figure out how much that actually was on a 133 acre pivot. And I did the math on it, and it was like 15 or 18 acres worth. And, you take 15 or 18 acres where you're not yielding as well because the soil is colder and wetter and potentially more disease, tying up fertilizer. It's a significant amount. So, like other people have said, it's very important to get it spread evenly, because one of the no-tillers that I heard said that planting of the next season starts harvest of the previous season.
I'd just like to add a couple other things. You guys are certainly right about spreading that residue out of the combine. You can't get any better use of your time than that. But also think about the material that doesn't go through the combine, so the stubble that's left behind. Think about how high you need it, if you need to shred it for the next operation, or if you need to leave it standing so there's not such a mess.
Yeah, that's a good point, Tyson. Following our cereal crops, we'll often just leave the straw as tall as we can manage it. and plant cover crops into that straw. And then we have just an architecture for climbing plants to grow on. And even though that material is up kind of in the air getting oxidized, if we were to shred it and it's a really heavy, you know, a strong yielding cereal crop, if we were to shred all that, we would have such a thick soil armor that we might just be inviting the voles back in, and we'll have other challenges with getting the cover crop up. So like you're saying, Tyson, it's definitely a balance and thinking forward about what you want to do. And that brings me to another point. When we're growing cover crops in our conventional tillage program, we're a little bit too greedy maybe, and we want to have that living root in the ground as long as possible. So we wait till the last second to mow and till prior to planting beans or another row crop. And that's really kind of gotten us into trouble in the past. So we're going to be more aggressive going forward. And even though we're having a living root in the ground, we're going to be mowing those cover crops through the spring, so that when we're ready to plant and we're doing that groundwork ahead of a few days or a week ahead of planting, we have much less material to incorporate, so that our groundwork is easier. The planting will be more uniform. We won't have a lot of material to deal with when we're going through to plant. And then, you know, the few days following planting are so crucial for us in weed control. And when we have a lot of residue to deal with in the 10 to 20 days after planting, when we're running tine harrows, blanket harrows, or a first pass, really delicate pass with some other steel cultivator, if we have a lot of trash, it just does not go well. We get frustrated, we tear beans out, we tear corn out, we don't kill weeds. So it's that balance of having living roots in the ground, having some above ground solar panels to capture carbon and, you know, convert sunlight into energy for the soil, but also not having too much. And that also sort of relates to not overfeeding the soil. Maybe, you know, if you're trying to incorporate a giant cover crop knee high right before you plant something, you're giving the soil a huge giant meal, you know, a full huge baked potato and a 16-ounce steak, and the soil just can't consume all that fast. And that's when you definitely get nutrients to tie up, right? Because all your microbes are going to work on that instead of supporting the living plants that you're trying to grow as a cash crop. And I see in the chat, there was another question about grazing with cattle in the winter. And we have done that. We do that on occasion where it makes sense logistically for us. We'll have cattle here in the winter or in the spring calving, and we will graze on cover crops in the spring, particularly for those crops that we plant later, you know, in June or late May. So we'll have a few head of cattle, you know, not very many, and we try to keep the numbers fairly manageable just from a work perspective. But we do graze our cover crops in the winter. Have to be mindful of what you're doing. You don't want to put them in there and make a big mess if it thaws out and gets all boggy and you get a bunch of rain. But it is an important part of the equation for a lot of people, and increasingly us, just to manage that much cover crop residue.
There is something that maybe Tyson should speak to here. In the Treasure Valley, Tyson, and I think it may be Brad McIntyre is involved in kind of a brokering a deal where he matches cattle producers with cover crop growers. Is that correct?
You know, I haven't heard of that specifically, but through our little group that we're kind of trying to unofficially do that, you know, just tie people together to get them the right information, or like you say, match up growers with cattle producers.
It might be something we ought to consider around here in the future, but I'm surprised Marlin didn't jump all over that.
You know, we've talked about that, but if you go to church or the coffee shop or the bar, that seems to spread pretty quick. As you drive to church, you see who's got the cover crops and you sit by them on the pew. I mean, that's what happened to Brad McIntyre. He had 2 or 3 neighbors say, "Hey, Brad, what are you doing with that 150 acres of cover crop?" So he didn't need to advertise it. at the coffee shop or church or at the football game. It was pretty well advertised.
Well, Marlon, which one is best? The bar, the church, or the coffee shop?
The football game, especially if your team's losing. And to follow up on that, when I was state agronomist in Idaho, Gene Shook, the old SRC, tried to match up a cattlemen's association with some sort of cover crop thing, but it never worked. I mean, nobody knew about it to get on it, but it was a good thought, you know, it was a good thing. Hey, we did that, but I don't ever remember anybody saying it made a difference. I've never seen in my short that somebody couldn't find, if there was cover crops, there's people looking for cattle all the time. Yeah, you know, it's just farmers just know if the neighbor's got something to graze or not.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was just gonna say, that
Tyson, I think you're muted there.
yeah, having a few technical issues with this phone. I was just saying that, yeah, the word spreads pretty quick. If you ask one cattleman about grazing feed, if he doesn't want it, he'll know 10 people that do, and the word gets around pretty easily.
Hey, I made a little post on the chat that one of our producers in Wheatland, Wyoming, so maybe an hour north of Cheyenne, he has a big header for his beans that has some sort of attachment on it that blows air to help lift those beans up into the header. That's the first air header I've seen, Lance. Are they very common?
Not around here, they're not, but I've seen videos of them online. You see quite a few guys, you know, that do dry beans consistently in the Dakotas or Minnesota or places like that, Nebraska, places like that have an air. It's an attachment, and it'll just go on ahead of the reel and just has fingers that blow back, so the beans will clear that cutter bar and get into the header better. You know, if I was doing that consistently, I think I would probably get one of those, but. Yeah, they're not around here much or at all.
Yeah, and in addition to that, and I think you're talking about the Crary bolt-on units, which are very good units, but even Geringhoff is now making flexible draper heads with an air system built in, delivery right behind the sickle. So as the bean falls off the sickle, it's actually carried back onto the belt on a cushion of air. So it's pretty impressive units, but yeah, that's the same concept.
So I see that Matt has a question. Matt, did you want to address a question here?
Yeah, well, actually, just want to jump in on the integration of livestock grazing. So I've got goats, not cattle, and I know corrugates aren't as big a deal where most of the folks that are calling in are as they are over here. But last fall, I was able to do a pretty interesting thing with Simplot and Allied out of the U of I Department of Research and Extension Center. I had a bunch of cover crops and had a field day, and then they wanted to see about getting them grazed. And then we were looking at, you know, regrowth of some of the winter barleys and how it tillered out, or did we completely obliterate it? And maybe a chaff row management tool is to use smaller, cheaper goats, smaller livestock. But one of the field men was really intrigued by the fact that in his estimation, the corrugates were, and the furs and everything were so undisturbed because of the lower weight animal that he said he could have gone right into it the next year and wouldn't have had any additional field work, but did have his residue managed, as opposed to, you know, their initial thought of bringing cattle through. Then obviously they'd had to recorrugate at a minimum. So just wanted to throw that out there.
That's really interesting, Matt. Is that an observation you've seen in other experience you've had as well, grazing your goats?
Well, so most of what we do isn't isn't crop stuff. I have got into cover crops and did like 70 acres of a 22-way mix this summer. But for me, most of the time, my goats are busy doing other jobs. And the Parma thing was just, I just wanted to see what they would eat and what they wouldn't, because there's not a lot of research out there about goats. And so the finding out that we could do, chaff row residue management was just a kind of a very nice added bonus. It wasn't really what we were looking for. It was more to see what they would eat and what they wouldn't. And then we found out, hey, there'd be maybe some secondary benefits here. And actually they said before they worked it in that following spring, we grazed it in November, late November, early December on some July and September. There's like 30 different test plots, but some of the winter cereal grains, they actually found that they tilled out better. And they thought, if they were going to go, take them to harvest, that they would have actually preferred the grazed areas, and then also the irrigation that existed from them, annihilating them. Some of your early season cheatgrasses, wherever, they just kind of gone away.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think there's overall a lot of focus on cattle in these systems. And I think remembering that there are other animals and small animals that may have different benefits is really important there. So thanks for adding that.
Just more tools.
So I wanted to ask another question here, and again, this is one that's pretty general, so anyone feel free to chime in. I'm curious, and it's come up in a couple of the videos and a lot of conversations, what weather-related or climate-related observations people have seen with some of these practices, whether it be cover crops or increased residue on the ground or reduced or no tillage, things like that. What observations you've had in response to strange or different weather conditions? Like this year was a really cold and wet spring and even early summer, and then it got really hot, and then we had an early frost. And I'm curious about observations from some of these soil health focused systems and how they've been impacted differently, good or bad, than more conventional systems.
Well, in our experience, it's been that having those thick layers of soil armor or even a modest amount of residue really, of course, cools things down, so to speak, or doesn't allow the soil to warm up as quickly in the spring. But it's more complicated than that. I think overall it modulates the temperature. You don't have the daily swings of extremes as much. We had thermometers out in our rye, standing rye, before we planted, and everything looked great. We were at 65 degrees, and we thought, let's do this. The rye's ready to kill. Let's plant. And then, of course, as soon as we laid down that thick rye mat, the soil stopped heating and cooled down a little bit. And consistently, I think I've shared this on a previous episode or previous call we've had, but consistently we never broke 70, 75 degrees where the rye mat was really thick, whereas 100 feet away on the other side of the pivot where we had bare ground, daily soil temperatures would get up in the 80s, and the surface temperature measured with an infrared thermometer that Rich had, would measure in the 90s. And so that's sort of bad for, getting your soil health going, because your soil's naked and it's getting really cooked in that top layer there. But it's also warming up the soil below, and that's how all our plants are bred, is to have this warm loose soil to get going and get up and grow. So that's another reason why we're trying to sort of engage some breeders and try to find edible bean varieties that can tolerate those cooler conditions. Because overall, having soil temps, below a certain threshold, I forget what it is, I'm sure someone on the call knows, but keeping your soil cool, not cold, but cooler, in the 70s and 80s is much better than having 90 and 100 degree soil.
For sure. Thanks for sharing that. I wanted to bring out something from the video with Lance, where you discussed being able to slow down your pivot in the corn specifically, that your soil was able to take on more water with more residue on the ground. And I thought that was a really interesting point that I hadn't heard explicitly, the ability to warm up the ground because you were able to slow down your pivot. And granted, this is one example, but is this the first year that you've noticed that, or have you noticed that prior as well?
Well, see, I don't know if I would say that the ground was warmer because I ran the pivot slower, but just the plant didn't experience that cooling of the water so much. Just because, when we compare, a neighbor's field or somebody we knew that was under gravity, corn, same day length, similar area, that they were able to plant a longer season corn, or their corn would be finished sooner just on gravity ground. Whereas on the pivot ground where we're watering it, if we were under conventional tillage, we were probably watering it once every 30 hours or something like that. It was going around there again. And so I was just cooling that plant down consistently. And so where I was able to slow the pivot down, it would take more like 52 hours to make a revolution. And so that plant would have a longer time of getting warm during the day. While the soil was still cooler because of the residue, that plant was able to not be cooled down, just with that cold water more often. So I think over the past couple of years, just been able to see that.
I'll add that, and Steve made this comment when he visited one day, that we had such a thick rye mat, pivot tracks were no longer an issue. That we would put on a lot of water. We're fortunate that our soils are very sandy and we're able to put on a lot more water than salmon tract or other, finer soils in the Magic Valley. So capacity is not so much of an issue. We can put on plenty of water in one rotation. And sometimes we do that so that, as Lance was saying, we don't have to come back as frequently. But in doing so, we can generate some pretty good tracks, and we just didn't have that issue. You can drive super high speed across our pivot tracks in that field and not have any kind of issue. Whereas other places, you certainly are gonna have a big bump.
Awesome. Thank you. So it is nearing about 2 o'clock here. So we're about an hour and a half in. I do want to be respectful of folks' time, but I want to kind of reopen the floor, see if there are any other things that people want to add, ask, etc. Because this has been a really, really great conversation so far.
Well, one thing I have a question, relates to Bill's question kind of on direct harvest. Has anybody thought about, or does anyone know of any quantification of the results or the benefit or detraction maybe of leaving your roots in the ground, particularly with beans or other legumes? If we cut our beans or they get rod weeded or one-stepped or whatever, we're, as Lance was saying, we're tearing up all that soil. But if we just cut them off and we leave those roots in the ground, we also leave all the nodules that legume has created directly in the ground where they're accessible to the soil biology. And if they get yanked out and they sit on top, what happens to all that supposedly bioavailable nitrogen if it's just sitting on top of the soil? Does it just, oxidize off and end up back in the atmosphere? Or do we get any enough gain from tearing those beans out and putting them in windrows and picking them up with a combine? Whereas if we just swath them or if we direct harvest them, what's the difference there? That's sort of one of those fertility related questions that probably, keeps me up at night. I don't know if anybody else worries about it, but.
I'll try and see if I can dig some more concrete examples up for you, Cooper, but hunch would be that leaving it in the soil makes it much more available than if it's on the surface. But I've got a note to look into it.
Yeah, most of the microbes live in the soil. There's a handful of species that live on top, like saprophytic fungus, and some of the mites that shred, but for the most part, they have interaction right at that soil surface. I think the other thing that I've always thought about, Cooper, is the better the home I can build, the better habitat I can build, meaning the aggregate, that's where the microbes live. And if I destroy their habitat, how can I expect them to do their function?
Yeah, sure.
We need an email to Steve.
We need to give them food, water, and shelter, right? Otherwise, they're not going to be very happy and not going to want to help us do any work.
I was listening to a Gabe Brown video a month ago or better, and he was talking about his Sudan grass does not freeze at 32 degrees. And I thought, that's the bunch of bull crap. How does Sudan grass not freeze at 32? Okay, 29.2, whatever. His Sudan grass does not freeze when his neighbors does. And my question is why? How? It's because his biology is so ramped up that the respiration is causing heat to come up through the canopy and to increase that soil temperature enough that he doesn't freeze his cover crop or his Sudan grass crop on his first go round of frost.
And or higher sugar
first
content.
time I'd ever saw that. Say again.
I said may have something to do with higher sugar content in the vascular tissue of the plants as well.
Yeah, maybe a little
Higher
antifreeze.
solutes.
Yeah. Higher photosynthetic rate and higher photosynthetic capacity. Pretty cool though, but as an agronomist, I never knew that would occur, that one guy's place would freeze and the next guy's wouldn't. That just kind of blew me away.
Hey, Jackie, I had a question for the group as a whole of, where do we keep doing these next year? Is this worth doing? Do we expand it? Do we keep it the same? I just kind of like a little feedback on, what we need to do next year. It's going to look a little different in some ways. Maybe Jackie can talk to that a little bit going forward, but we kind of want to know where to go from here.
And I just tack on to that, if you're not comfortable or don't want to say something out loud in this session, feel free to send a message privately or email or call as well to provide any feedback, because I think I would echo Bill's statement there. It's super important to hear from you all about what works, what doesn't, what we should do better, what we should do different or the same. So.
Well, the point of this is to not only help those who have participated, but to reach out to others. And I've told Jackie this several times, that it's just been a really good experience to work with these folks. And Jackie and Bill and just the enthusiasm we have. So if this has been helpful, we do need to continue it. Bill said that we had the other day like 900 views. Was it, Bill? Was that right, of all of these videos?
Yeah, we're close to 1,100 now with the recently added one. So that's a pretty good outreach for something like this.
Yeah. So anyway, this has just been a really good project, and I really have been fortunate to be involved, and we're hoping that maybe we can get Jackie back as the videographer, because that was some spectacular work. She earned the Cecil B. DeMille's Award.
Please, as you're reflecting on the season and as you're reflecting on this and sort of soil health forum, et cetera, please feel free to send along any feedback, positive, negative, neutral, whatever it is. It'll just help us get better.
So Jackie, I'd like to thank you for all the hard work you've put into this. It's been a pleasure working with you, and it's been, I think, worth our time to be part of, and hopefully other people will benefit from from our mistakes, I guess. I was actually encouraged yesterday. Cooper sent me a link to a no-tiller video, YouTube video that guys from Tennessee, I think anyway. First thing he said was how many mistakes he made in the beginning. I thought, okay, well, we're not the only people out there who flunked on our first attempt, so it's okay. We're going to keep on keeping on until we get it figured out. So thank you for your support on that, and hopefully we can keep this forum going in some form or another going forward.
For sure. You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure to work with you all this year. And I guess on that note, forum moving forward, we do plan on having a forum meeting. We're still finalizing the date, and it'll almost definitely be a virtual format. This seems to be the new norm, but we'll be sharing some of the results from the Soil Your Undies project with the Magic Valley Soil Health project and some other interesting things, and kind of open up the discussion hopefully to a larger group again. So keep your eyes out for that notification coming up.
Yeah, I would just echo what Fred said. Great to work with you, Jackie and Steve and Bill. Thanks for your hard work putting all this together, and let's keep it up.
Thank you all so much for being here today and for sharing your insights and wisdom, questions, etc. And I look forward to seeing y'all again soon, probably on Zoom. So take care, everyone.